It all began with a woman, a Jewish immigrant from the Russian Empire, a fugitive. He, a hereditary French Republican, heir to the triumph of science. Their meeting was a mistake, a collision of two opposites. But their love became a common search, a search for what they both had lost, a search for God. The void. It all began with a woman, a Jewish emigrant from the Russian Empire, a fugitive. He, a hereditary French Republican, heir to the triumph of science. Their meeting was a mistake, a collision of two opposites. But their love became a common search, a search for what they both had lost, a search for God. Paris was a city of light. The 19th century bled into the 20th. Reason sat on a throne. The Sorbonne was its cathedral. Young Jacques Maritain walked its halls. He was a child of this new age. His blood was Protestant. His mind was scientific. He was supposed to be a victor. Instead, he felt a deep hollowness, an emptiness the logic of his professors could not fill. Then he met her, Raissa Umansov. Her family had escaped the violence of Russia. She had a sharp mind, an intense spirit. She saw the same void he did. They studied biology. They dissected life. They found only mechanisms. They studied philosophy. They found only arguments. The world was a perfectly constructed machine, a machine with no purpose. Their conversations were long. They walked through the Jardin des Plantes. They watched the city breathe around them, the beautiful, pointless city. Despair was not a feeling. It was a conclusion, a diagnosis. Life was a terminal condition. Its only symptom was suffering. Their shared intellect became a shared prison. One day they made a pact. It was a calm, rational agreement. They would give the world a final chance, a few months, maybe a year. They would search for a single reason to continue, a single thread of meaning in the vast nothing. If their search yielded nothing, if the silence remained unbroken, they would end their lives. A walk to the Seine, a final step. It was not an emotional outburst. It was the only logical response to a meaningless universe. The beggar prophet. Their pact hung in the air, a silent clock ticking. Every book they opened was empty. Every conversation led back to the void. Then a name surfaced. A friend mentioned him, Leon Bloy, a writer, a Catholic. They were skeptical. The church seemed like another dead end, another system of thought. But they were desperate. They agreed to a meeting. The man who met them was not a philosopher. He was a storm. Bloy was a man of extremes. He called himself a pilgrim of the absolute. His poverty was a weapon. His faith was a fire. He lived in a small, dark apartment. The room smelled of poverty and old paper. He did not welcome them with gentle words. He looked at them with piercing eyes. He saw their intellectual pride. He saw their hidden despair. Bloy did not offer arguments. He spoke of saints and sinners. He spoke of suffering as the shadow of God. His words were not meant to convince. They were meant to break. He was the beggar prophet. He demanded everything. He offered only God. For Jacques and Raissa, this was a shock. They came from a world of polite debate. Bloy's world was one of spiritual warfare. It was ugly. It was uncomfortable. It was brutally real. They kept returning to that small apartment. They listened. They read his furious books. The logic of the Sorbonne began to feel thin. It was a house of cards. Bloy's faith was a block of granite. It did not explain the world. It anchored it. The choice was no longer about finding a reason. The choice was about surrender. They stopped looking for proof. They started to learn how to pray. In the year 1906, Jacques and Raissa were baptized. The cold water was a shock. It felt like an ending and a beginning. The ultimatum was answered. The weapon of Thomas. The fire of faith was bright. It burned away the old despair. But a fire needs a hearth to hold it. Jacques' mind, trained by the hard logic of science, needed a structure. Faith was a gift. It was not an argument. He stood between two worlds. The raw, absolute belief of Leon Bloy. The cold, critical reason of his university days. A bridge was missing. He found it in a dusty corner of history, in the writings of a 13th century monk, Thomas Aquinas. At first, the words were a fortress. The scholastic arguments felt dense, obsolete. a language for a world that no longer existed. It was the philosophy his old professors had dismissed. A relic. He pushed forward. He read the Latin. He wrestled with the logic. He felt like an archaeologist digging through dry earth. Then, he broke through. The fortress was not a prison. It was a cathedral. An immense, perfectly designed structure of thought. Everything had its place. The smallest detail connected to the largest truth. Aquinas did not build a wall between faith and reason. He built a staircase. One led to the other. The world was real. The senses could be trusted. The intellect could lead a man toward God. It was a stunning revelation. Reason was not faith's enemy. It was its partner. This was the weapon he needed. A way to think about God with the same rigor he had once used to study biology. Maritain began his life's work. He would take this ancient system and make it new. He would sharpen its edges. He would point it at the problems of his own century. This was the birth of Thomism. It was not a retreat into the past. It was an invasion of the present. Armed with the logic of an old saint, Maritain prepared to face the chaos of the modern world. A union of minds. Their house in Moudon was a quiet suburb of Paris. But the house itself was not quiet. It became a destination, a port in the intellectual storm of Europe. It was not a salon for polite society. It was a workshop for the soul. The door was always open. The conversations never truly ended. Artists came. Poets came. Philosophers came. Marc Chagall brought his colors, his dreams of a floating world. Jean Cocteau brought his sharp wit, his restless creativity. Nikolai Berdyaev brought his heavy Russian mysticism, his experience of revolution and exile. They were a collection of brilliant, difficult people. They argued, they drank, they prayed. The house was a space where a painter and a theologian could speak the same language. Jacques was the anchor, the intellectual pillar. His study was the center of gravity. His Thomism provided the framework. But Raissa was the heart. Her presence was quiet. She listened more than she spoke, yet everyone felt her influence. She had a gift for seeing the person behind the ideas. She guided conversations away from pure argument. She turned them toward personal truth. She was the soul of their circle. Their marriage was a unique creation. It was a partnership of thought and prayer. His mind built the complex structures of his philosophy. Her spirit infused them with life. They wrote together. His books were filled with her insights. Her poems were shaped by his ideas. In the evenings, after the guests had left, their real work began. They would sit with a single text. They would talk for hours, untangling a difficult passage, forging a new idea. It was a love story written in the margins of books, a shared life that became a shared body of work. This union was their fortress. It would have to be strong. The world outside the walls of Moudon was growing dark. The philosopher against fascism. The warmth of Moudon could not keep the cold out forever. A new wind was blowing across Europe. It carried the sound of marching boots, the smell of burning books. Politics was no longer a subject for debate. It was becoming a question of survival. For a time, Maritain saw allies in strange places. He had been close to a movement called Action Française, a group of fierce nationalists. They promised order. They used the language of tradition. They seemed like a bulwark against the chaos. Then the illusion shattered. The Vatican condemned the movement. Its leader, Charles Maurras, was an atheist who used the church as a political tool. The choice became stark. It was a choice between a political tribe and a universal faith. For Maritain, there was no hesitation. He broke with the nationalists. The backlash was immediate. Friends became enemies. He was called a traitor, a man who had abandoned his own side. He stood firm. Then came Spain. A civil war tore the country apart. Many Catholics sided with General Franco. They saw him as a crusader, a protector of the church against the red tide of communism. Maritain looked at the news. He saw the bombing of civilians. He saw the executions. He saw faith being twisted into a justification for violence. He could not stay silent. He publicly condemned the atrocities committed in the name of a holy war. He was accused of siding with atheists. He responded that the gospel could not be defended with terror. He did not just denounce, he built. He needed to offer a different vision. He wrote one of his most important books. Its title was Integral Humanism. It was his answer to the twin monsters of his time, the soulless collectivism of communism, the brutal paganism of fascism. He argued for a new society, a society built around the human person. Not an isolated individual, but a person connected to community, a person whose dignity came directly from God. This was not a blueprint, it was a declaration. The philosopher had entered the political arena. His weapon was an idea. Ambassador to the Vatican. The war broke their world. France fell. The boots that marched in the distance were now in the streets of Paris. Moudon was no longer safe. Jacques and Raissa fled. They crossed a broken Europe. They found refuge in America. Exile was a bitter pill. New York was a city of noise and speed. It was not the gentle quiet of their home. They had lost their library. They had lost their friends. They had lost their country. But they did not lose their purpose. Maritain became a voice for a France that was not defeated, a France that was still fighting. He taught at Princeton. He lectured at Columbia. His English was thick with a French accent, but his words were clear. He spoke of democracy. He spoke of human rights. He became a figure of the resistance in exile. He wrote. He broadcasted. His philosophy was no longer for the classroom. It was for the war effort. Then the war ended. The news came in waves. Paris liberated. The enemy defeated. A man returned to France to lead it. General Charles de Gaulle. He was a man of action, a man of tradition. He was rebuilding a shattered nation. He needed people he could trust. He sent a message to the philosopher in America. The request was a surprise. De Gaulle did not want another book. He wanted an ambassador. He wanted Jacques Maritain to be the voice of France at the Vatican. The philosopher was being asked to become a diplomat. He would leave the world of ideas. He would enter the world of power. He accepted. He arrived in Rome, a city of ancient stones and quiet secrets. His new life was one of protocol, of careful conversations with cardinals in red robes. He was no longer dissecting arguments in a classroom. He was building alliances in marbled halls. His deep knowledge of the Church was now a political asset. He worked to heal the wounds between France and the Holy See, wounds left by the war. His authority was not from a government. It came from a lifetime of thought and faith. The scholar in the halls of power was a strange sight, but he was effective. The ideas he had forged in quiet rooms were now at work in the world. The silent finale. His time as an ambassador was finished. The world was rebuilding. A new conversation was starting inside the church he had served his whole life. It was called the Second Vatican Council, a great gathering in Rome. Its purpose was to open the windows, to let in the air of the modern world, the world Maritain had been speaking to for decades. His books were on the tables of the bishops. His ideas were in their speeches. Words he had written in his study in Meudon echoed under the dome of St. Peter's. The dignity of the human person, the freedom of conscience, the role of the laity in the world. The Council's final documents were a vindication of his work. The Church was officially embracing the best of modern thought. The bridge he had started building as a young man was finally complete. The Pope himself, Paul VI, was his friend. At the end of the council, the Pope gave a message to the world's intellectuals. He handed it personally to one man, Jacques Maritain. But his greatest partner was gone. Raissa's health had been failing for years. In the year 1960, she died. Her death was the severing of a limb. Their life had been one conversation. Now it was silent. He wrote a book about her. He called it The Journal of Raissa. He was alone with their shared memories. The world no longer needed him. His work was done. His body was old. He made a final, surprising choice. He would not retire to a comfortable life. He would not remain a public figure. He sought out a small, poor community, the Little Brothers of Jesus, an order inspired by the life of Charles de Foucauld, men who lived among the poor, who worked with their hands. In the year 1970, the famous philosopher became one of them. He wore their simple habit. He lived in a small room. He prayed with them. he was an old man among young men. The intellectual giant of the 20th century spent his last years in quiet work, in prayer. The journey that began with a pact over a river in Paris, a search for meaning in the void, it ended here. In silence, in a small room, a life come full circle,